Hey everyone, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for helping me reach 100 subscribers. I honestly couldn't have done this without your love, support, and constant encouragement. Every like, comment, and subscribe means a lot to me. Now let's keep this journey going. Our next target is 200 subscribers, and I know we can do it together. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's grow as a family. Thank you once again. When Luffy vanishes inside ancient ruins, the Straw Hats are pulled into a terrifying journey through his past. Trapped within Luffy's memories, the crew witnesses moments of brotherhood with Ace and Sabo, childhood pain, and scars Luffy never shared. As past and present blur, the Straw Hats must confront truths that were never meant for them to see, learning what truly shaped their captain. To escape, they must not only find Luffy, but also come to terms with the weight of the memories he carried alone. Disclaimer: this story do not belong to me. The author is Warm Memories and Brotherly Bonds by RoseDragonWitch. Respect to author.
Chapter 48, Poison vs. Rubber, Miracle in Hell. Chapter 47, Poison vs. Rubber, Miracle on Level 5.5. Luffy and Ace. The entire area around them was burnt and littered with broken boulders and splintered trees. Both Luffy and Ace were both breathing hard, completely worn out and starting to wonder just how long this battle was going to go on. Damn, Ace smirked as he looked up to Luffy, who was on his knees and his tongue rolling out of his head as he panted. You never did know when to give up. Yeah, Luffy smirked back. Neither did you. Huh, you got that right, little brother. Ace smirked right back at him as he wiped some blood off from his mouth. At that moment both of their stomachs began to let out loud growls and to put their hands on their bellies. Hungry, need food, they both said together before they looked up and laughed. I think that we spent too much time together when we were kids, Ace chuckled as he leaned back comfortably on the dirt. Hey, not that I mind though. Hey, after I win, how about we head down to the party bar, huh? We should be able to find some food there. Really? Luffy asked excitedly, drooling at the thought. Just so long as they have some meat there. That was when he realized what Ace said and yelled, hey. Who said that you were gonna win? I did, Ace sneered tauntingly at him, so what are you gonna do about it? What do you think? Luffy demanded, jumping to his feet again. I'm gonna kick your ass. Doing a good job of that so far, Ace taunted, but he knew that the two of them had been going at this for some time now, and it was starting to take its toll. This was, without a doubt, the longest that he had ever been able to fight with Luffy, showing that he had improved and come a long way since their childhood sparring matches. But he still had a long way to go if he wanted to be the strongest. And if he couldn't stand up to him, then what hope did he have against the seas? Still, this battle would soon be at an end, he could feel it. The sun will be rising in just a couple more hours and he had until then to find his answer. Did he want his little brother to win this fight? Yes, but that didn't mean that he was gonna make it easy. Luffy had to earn that right. And as he watched Luffy running towards him, he couldn't help but inwardly laugh. Who had ever heard about a big brother wanting to lose a fight with his little brother? Oh well, nothing about them was ever normal. Straw Hats. He really wanted Luffy to leave. Chopper asked them as they stared at the darkness around them, waiting for the next memory to come. Of course he did, Zoro said grimly, starting to pace around the area in a desperate attempt to vent some of his anger. If it were any of us and we heard that he was risking his life coming to save us, we'd want him to stay away, wouldn't we? It must be pure torture for him, Robin said softly as she looked down at her hand, lost in thought. I doubt that anything that Impel Down could do to him would be worse than imagining Luffy being imprisoned here because of him. The poor guy, Nami said as Frankie started to bawl. Oh man, that's so sad. I love these two. Frankie sobbed out, and broke down completely. They're both in danger but all they're thinking of is each other. I mean, Sniff, who would do something like that for your bro? And he cried rivers of tears as Brook strummed up his guitar, fighting his own tears but failing completely as the front of his clothes were soon soaked. I wish that there was something that I could have done to help. The pain that Ace-san must have felt when he heard. This is all so personal that I don't think we have any right to see anymore. I know what you're saying, Zoro said sternly, but we're stuck here. Nothing we can do about it now. More than anything, he was dreading seeing this fight Luffy was going to have against Magellan. He knew Luffy well enough by now to know that he had to have fought the warden here, and if Magellan was even half as dangerous as he thought. The memory came back before he could finish that image, and they were back where they left Luffy. He, Bon Clay, Buggy, and Mr. 3 were all standing around in a group right above the entrance to level 4 while the Minotaurus remained unconscious on the floor. Listen, I want to make sure of it one more time. Buggy said seriously. Sure, Luffy said agreeably, as if wondering what the problem was. Buggy pointed an accusing finger at him and asked, you still plan on going to level 4? Well, he's come too far to turn back now, Sanji offered, looking back down into the pits of hell. He wasn't sure that he wanted to see what was down on that level though. Yeah, Luffy said happily before he asked, you wanna come along after all? You couldn't pay me to come along. Mr. 3 exclaimed, still sweating wax. If I keep melting like this there won't be anything left of me. How many times do I have to explain it, you freaking dumbass? Buggy asked as Bon Clay spent his free time spinning happily in a circle and singing to himself in a contented way. Can't you see that pillar of smoke? That's the Inferno Hell. Yeah, I think we got that a while ago, Usopp sighed, wondering why they didn't just leave already if they wanted to go so badly. We're not going. Not to a place like that. Buggy finished stubbornly. Why? Luffy asked, now actually picking his nose. He's got such a short attention span, Robin smiled fondly. Though here I'm not bothered by it like normal, Nami said, finding this all funny. Anything that makes Buggy and 3 this upset was alright in her book. What do you mean, why? Buggy and Mr. 3 yelled out in unison at him. Mr. 3 pointed up and said slowly and clearly as if he was trying to explain to someone who was deaf, we're trying to break out. Break out. We gotta go up. Up. Understand. Buggy said as he pointed upwards to the ceiling, but it was clear that Luffy wasn't listening at all as he pulled out a really big booger from his nose and examined it. If they want to go then, Frankie sighed. Luffy's not stopping them as he. I just think that they love to hear themselves talk, Robin offered with a shrug. From what she had seen of them since viewing these memories was that they never passed up an opportunity to speak their minds. Are you even listening? Mr. 3 and Buggy yelled at him. Just give it up, Straw Hat, said Bon Clay, who had finally stopped spinning and was looking politely annoyed by all this yelling. We don't need those spineless wimps. I have to agree with him there, Nami agreed. At least Bon Clay was more than willing to help Luffy out. She had a feeling that he was going to be twice as helpful as those two were gonna be in this place. Who you callin' a big-nosed wimp? Buggy snapped at him. Did my ears hear him right? Brook asked in confusion. Because I don't remember him saying that. Though I don't have ears anymore, yo-ho-ho-ho. That's because he didn't say that, Usopp said with some sweat drops falling from his face. What the hell? Bon Clay yelled at him. How could you possibly mistake what I said for that? He looked ready to fight him but seemed to decide against it. Fine, then, he decided as he stood on his toes. I'll just twirl. I love this guy. Frankie laughed as Bon Clay laughed and spun around like a ballerina. He's as funny as when we met him. Chopper said smiling. This ain't a joke. Buggy screamed at him. Well, with this group, it's hard to remember that, Sanji said fighting the urge to laugh himself. Huh? Brooks suddenly asked as he looked around, does anybody else here hear that cracking sound? They stopped talking long enough to see that he was right. They could hear something cracking and crumbling as if something made of stone was falling apart. Where's that sound coming from? Usopp asked in surprise as Luffy was looking up to the giant fan above them. Oh, hey, Luffy called out, check it out. The ceilings keeps getting higher and higher. Wow, it is, Chopper said in amazement, shielding his eyes to look up at it. I wonder how they were doing that. Chopper, Robin said, having realized what was going on. I'm afraid that it's not the ceiling that keeps getting higher. Then what are? Nami began before her face suddenly turned blue and she looked down to see what she was talking about. Mr. 3 was looking up at the ceiling as well and had just asked what they thought the trick was that they used for that cracking sound. But they all blinked and it all hit everyone at once what was going on. We're the ones falling down. Mr. 3 screamed out. It turned out all the blasting and violence going on from their fight with the Minotaurus that the platform they were standing on couldn't take it and finally crumbled away. The slab of rock that they were all standing on had broken off and fell through the smoke. Usopp and Chopper both shrieked at the realization and Brook was looking close to freaking out as he cried, this is terrible. We're gonna fall right into a sea of boiling blood. We are, Chopper screamed. But I don't wanna go to hell. We're safe here, Robin called, it's those four that we should be worried about. Speaking of which, those four were trying to stay on the platform as they screamed and fell to the floor below them. Damn it, my muggy ball was too powerful. Buggy cried, and despite his terror, he was smiling proudly. It caused the floor to crumble. It really wasn't all that powerful, Frankie said in a bored way. No, Bon Clay called out, still spinning joyfully. It was because of my fierce kicks. Well, that I can understand, Brooks said, thinking back to how the Minotaurus had sunk a few inches into the stone from that kick. And I'm sure that had something to do with that. You're wrong, Luffy yelled as he butted in. It was because my punch was too strong. It was all your faults. Nami screamed at them, and if you don't do something you'll be boiled alive. Why are they even arguing over whose fault it was? Chopper cried out, as if stuck in a nightmare, wondering when they would hit bottom. It's a men thing, Robin said, and one of only the few of them who remained calm despite the situation. But Nami's right, they better think of something if they want to live. I hope that they don't end up hitting the bottom and drown in a vat of scorching blood. You're not helping, Robin. Usopp screamed at her. Oh, no, it was all because my wax powers, Mr. 3 started, but then trailed off.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
Oh, right, never mind. It wasn't you, okay. The other three shouted as they sank through the steam, now so thick they couldn't see anything going on. The Straw Hats were all completely blinded by the blackness around them, but they heard the four of them screaming just before the memory faded completely, "We're all gonna fall into the fire." There was nothing but silence around them, suddenly feeling that when the memory faded there is a bad thing. What happened? Nami croaked out, breaking the awkward silence, her eyes full of terror at the thought of what might have happened to Luffy. Well, last I checked, Luffy was still very much alive, Zoro said, though he was looking slightly unnerved. He must have made it out of that. But as to how he did, he wasn't sure. But to his relief, the memory soon appeared and they looked to see what level 4 looked like for the first time. It looked a great deal like the upper levels, only this time the stone that they were on was so hot that they were glowing red. There were large chains that reminded them all of the one back on Thriller Bark, hanging from the ceiling, while the pathway that they were standing on was right over what looked like a gigantic cauldron that looked like it was full of fire. "What's with this place?" Usopp cried, backing away from the edge, and had to hold his hands over his mouth to keep himself from feeling sick. "It's freaking me out." "So this is the Inferno," Sanji said, some slight blueness hanging around his one showing eye. He couldn't believe that they actually had a place like this as he looked around. The heat up on level 3 was nothing compared to down here. This was much more like an oven than any frying pan, and just being down on this floor would have made him sweat like a pig in a matter of seconds. Even if these guys are criminals, how can the government actually get away with doing all these horrible things? Nami croaked out, staring around at the distant cells, where the prisoners were all trapped in this suffocating heat. What a horrible way to go. Monsters, all of them, Brooke said furiously. It's one thing to spend the rest of your days inside a prison, but to be tortured and suffer like this as well. At this rate, being a pirate seems to be more humane than to work for the government. Nami gulped down before she heard yells of pain. They turned around and they saw, to their relief, that Luffy and the others were still very much alive and seemed to have escaped their nasty fall with just some burns. But now they were all jumping up and down on the hot stone floor, except for Bon Clay, who was joyously spinning around. "Oh, thank goodness they're still safe," Brooke cried out in relief. Chopper sniffled a little as he cried, "Luffy had me really scared." "But how did they?" Frankie asked, wondering how they could have possibly avoided the fire. "I have a theory," Robin said. "I think that slab of rock they were standing on might have saved them. They could have jumped off that rock when they saw the platform here before it hit bottom." "So what you're saying is that it was actually a good thing that their footing caved in like it did?" Frankie asked. "I guess so," Zoro said, glad to see that luck was still on Luffy's side. He just hoped that it continued to be for the rest of this mess. "Hot, hot, hot, hot," Buggy cried as he jumped around. "What's with this floor? It's flashily hot. The air's so hot," Mr. 3 cried out, "that even my lungs feel like they're burning." "This is the worst floor yet," Frankie stated, wiping his brow as Chopper couldn't have looked happier that he wasn't here for real. He'd have suffered a heat stroke in no time at all. "Hurry," Luffy panted, "we've gotta hurry up and get out of here now." "Which way do we go?" Surprisingly, Bon Clay only laughed as he continued spinning and dancing, as if he couldn't feel any heat at all. "Wow, that guy is tough," Usopp said impressed. "It's amazing," Brooke called. "I feel as if my skin is shriveling off looking at this floor, ah. Not that I have skin anymore. Yo-ho-ho-ho. You three are hopeless." Bon Clay laughed happily. "If you clear your thoughts of all mundane thoughts, the fire isn't hot at all." "Really?" Chopper asked in wonder. "Mind over matter," Robin said lightly. "It's what Usopp does with his voodoo when he's trying to make you imagine being in pain." "Hey, it works, doesn't it?" Usopp asked at once. "Yes, but I also know that it will not work for long," Robin said, and she was proven right soon enough. "Not that I don't understand how you feel though," Bon Clay added, moving around them and they could see him slowly starting to sweat. "This place is a little hotter than level 3, don't you think?" he asked as his smile began to fade and the hot floor began to burn his shoes. "It is kinda hot, I do feel like I'm being roasted here." He suddenly stopped spinning and then started to scream, his face as red as a lobster. "Hot. He's making me roast just listening to him," Sanji sighed, pulling the collar of his shirt a little and loosening his tie, aching for an iced tea or something. "You're just making it worse." Luffy, Buggy, and Mr. 3 shouted at him as he began to join them in jumping up and down on the hot floor. Suddenly, Luffy was looking around, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air before a big smile appeared on his face. Without any warning to the others he went running off in one direction, leaving nothing but a dust trail behind him. "What's with him?" Frankie asked in surprise. This was different than before, it was as if Luffy suddenly knew which way to go and wasn't letting anything get in his way. "Think he found the way out?" Chopper asked in excitement. "Nope," Sanji said, recognizing that hungry look anywhere. "There's only one thing that could cause that." "Wait, where are you going?" Buggy shouted behind them as Bon Clay kept shouting how hot it was and Mr. 3 was yelling at him to shut up. But when Bon Clay looked up to see Luffy running off, he stopped jumping around and thought it over. Wait a second, the place that Straw Hat is running off to is. His eyes widened brightly before he began to prance right behind Luffy. The kitchen's over there. The kitchen, Frankie repeated exasperatedly. I had a feeling it was, Sanji said, and they all took off after them. He could smell the food. That was what he was following. Now isn't the time to be worrying about filling his stomach though. Nami called out. No, but Luffy's wearing himself out, Chopper shouted. Ever since coming here he's pretty much draining his strength. He always fights better when his stomach's full. If he has one more power boost, it might be enough to get him down to the next level. Brook cried out in understanding, and Ace-san is supposed to be on the next level. You think that they'll let him eat and get stronger? Nami snapped. Like hell they'll let that happen. Luffy needs to forget about that for now and just head down to the next floor. But the rest of them didn't want to think about what was going to happen as they heard Bon Clay happily calling out behind him for him to wait for him, for he was starving too. This was going too well for their usual standards and were sure not to last too much longer. Hancock had left. Magellan was surely going to deal with this personally, and something big had to have stopped Luffy long enough to prevent him from being able to save Ace. They managed to catch up with Luffy, who was still struggling between being hot and in bliss from the wonderful smell of food. It's hot, 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 Luffy cried before he sniffed the air and said dreamily, smells good. Hot, smells nice. He's such an idiot, Nami stated, not sure if she should laugh or not. Meanwhile, there was a large crowd of guards waiting for him up ahead and they were running at him, yelling to try and restrain him. Not that it did much good. Wimps, Zoro laughed, knowing that they weren't gonna last long. Ah, sure, a lot of them, Luffy said while panting, and they could see how tired he was looking at that moment. This floor is way hotter than the one above us, but as soon as I get something to eat, I'll feel 100 times better. He then grinned evilly as he charged at the guards, having an idea as to how best to deal with them all. That look never means good news either, Usopp said knowingly. Yeah, for the bad guys anyway, Nami agreed as Luffy jumped into the air, right above the guards. Gum gum, fireworks, he cried, and by exploding his limbs out, he looked like an exploding firework as he took out every last guard around him, knocking them right off the bridge. Yeah, now they're getting somewhere. Frankie cheered, punching the air excitedly. The enemies are dropping off like flies. They can't stop him now. But he spoke too soon, for no sooner did Luffy land on the walkway again, his pathway cleared and nothing standing in his way, did something fall from the ceiling. It was a goopy, purple substance, and as soon as it hit the floor it began to melt on the hot surface. Luffy had only narrowly avoiding that clump entirely. Damn, Luffy cried out startled. I thought that was a spear or something. Wait, what the hell is that stuff? Suddenly a few more drops fell and they then realized that it wasn't the heat from the floor that was melting, it was the purple substance that was burning the floor. That's... Brook gasped before every one of them had turned as white as bone and stared up in horror to see that he was there. They saw him clinging to the ceiling. Some of the straw hats fell back and shrieked when they saw Magellan up there, already dripping with poison, and there was malice in his face when he spotted Luffy. Hot, Luffy cried, jumping around. What is it? Jelly. Crap, Luffy, look out. Nami cried out just as Bon Clay, who was finishing up taking out a few remaining guards behind them, screamed out the same thing. Distracted, Luffy looked up in time to see Magellan drop from the ceiling and land directly in front of him with a resounding crash as Bon Clay screamed in panic. Damn, I knew it was too good to last. Usopp shrieked in fear, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene. We all knew this was coming, Zoro said as Chopper covered his mouth with his little hooves. But Zoro also had to hold on to the hilt of his sword to keep it from shaking. You've been running about freely for too long, Magellan said, the smoke clearing so that they could clearly see his face. There was anger there and a darkness in his face that clearly showed no mercy. He was going to deal with Luffy here and they knew that he wasn't afraid to kill him if he had to. Their eyes went to the same poison that was dripping off his body and sizzling on the hot floor. Who are you? Luffy questioned boldly, but it was Bon Clay behind them who answered. Magellan. He croaked out, and there was true terror in his face as he stared at the warden. This is the end for you, persistent vermin. Magellan hissed. I don't like the sound of that, Sanji said, puffing hard on his cigarette only to realize that it burnt out a long time ago and quickly lit up another one as Luffy and Magellan stood their ground, glaring at the other.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
The guards that Luffy took out were already starting to get back to their feet and gasped in horror when they saw that they were no longer alone. You would think that they have been glad to see that there was such a powerful ally there, but they were crawling away in panic at the sight of Magellan. This is bad, they heard one cry. It's too dangerous here, why are they freaking out? Frankie asked in confusion. Something tells me that Magellan might be even more ruthless than I first thought. Robin frowned, knowing all too well how brutal that the government can be. You don't think that he'll poison his own men, do you? Brook gasped at such a thought. They're sure acting like it, Zoro growled. It's poison we're talking about, Nami gulped. A single touch is all that it's gonna take for it to kill you. If it were me, I'd be running too. The inferno hell sure is hot, said Magellan, sweating poison from his body as the frightened guards began to run past Luffy, no longer thinking about fighting. Warden Magellan, please wait a second. One of them begged. Please don't fight him yet. Another screamed as they fled from them as fast as they could go. Get away as fast as you can. We'll be affected by the warden's poisons. A third screamed, having to crawl away. This can't be good, Usopp said, sweat now falling as well, but for a different reason as he watched Luffy watch the guards run. Luffy, what did you get yourself into this time? What the hell? Luffy said as he looked up at Magellan. And I'd almost gotten to the place where that nice smell was coming from, too. Luffy-san, forget the food and run. Brook called, now starting to panic as well, biting down on his bony fingers anxiously. This was one fight that he didn't want to see. He remembered when he was still the acting captain with the Rumbar pirates and how he and his old crew sailed straight into that sea of fog. He had died from poison along with the rest of his friends and he remembered just how painful that had been. The mere thought of his captain having to go through something like that made his heart hurt so much that he wanted to rip it out, though that kinda saved him the trouble since he didn't have one. Is there anything you can do to counter a poison man? Nami cried to the others, hoping that they might have an answer to how Luffy might survive this. They all looked to Robin and Chopper most of all, knowing that they were the best chance of having some ideas. Robin only shrugged helplessly as she said, I know that the poison fruit is able to grant the user the ability to produce and control various types of poison. Anything from mild to deadly, it all depends on what Magellan will use. But it has been proven that fire does have some neutralizing effect against toxins. Well, there's no shortage of that. Usopp said at once, looking to the smoke and flames that surrounded them, and he felt a little better, thinking that Luffy might have a chance after all. There's no telling what will happen, Robin said seriously. There's no point in me telling you how deadly it is, and she thought of those prisoners that were poisoned to death when they were watching Hancock visit Ace. Let us just count our blessings that Luffy managed to survive it after all. I'm in a hurry, Luffy screamed at Magellan, so move it. Get out of my way. There's no way that he's gonna move just because you're telling him to, Luffy. Sanji yelled angrily. You're quite high-spirited, Magellan said slowly, looking down at him like he was something mildly interesting, but his curiosity was quickly fading. But rest assured, soon, there'll be no need to eat anything anymore. Nami, Chopper, and Usopp all gulped at that threat. If they hadn't had seen Magellan's power firsthand, they wouldn't be as worried as they were right now, but hearing those screams of his victims were hard to erase from their minds. What are you talking about? Luffy yelled out, watching the poison fall. Straw Hat. Bon Clay cried out. You can't fight him. Luffy looked back at him as he went on, pointing a shaking hand at their enemy, that's Magellan. He's the warden of Impel Down. He has the powers of the poison devil fruit. Run away. He's too much for you to handle. Poison, Luffy repeated, looking back at the purple gunk with new understanding. So he's a poison man. That's right, Magellan answered darkly. Straw Hat Luffy, the rookie I hear has caused trouble wherever he's gone. That's for sure, Nami said at once, unable to stop herself. She secretly wondered just what kind of star Luffy was born under to get such cases of good and bad luck. Has opposed both the Navy and the world government, as well as a 300 million bounty on his head, Magellan said in disdain. I never dreamed that man would break into the legendary, impregnable prison. As the warden, it is disgraceful for me. Since when do we care about that? Sanji demanded, wishing that he could have said that to the man for real and gave him a piece of his mind. Magellan then said, I know what you've come for. You want to free your brother, the commander of Whitebeard's 2nd Division, Portgas D. Ace. How did he know? Chopper gasped in horror. I think it was only going to be a matter of time, Robin said coolly. They must have been wondering what would possess a man to sneak into this place single-handedly. Why else if not to rescue someone? And the higher-ups at Marine HQ must have put 2 and 2 together, if Garp hadn't already mentioned something like it to them. Now that they know what he's after, they'll do everything in their power to prevent it, Brook said. That goes without saying, Sanji said darkly. If they let Ace escape here, then they are screwed and the government would suffer even more humiliation. They'd probably have rolled the heads of everyone in this hellhole prison if something like that happened. However, it will be absolutely impossible for you to reach him, much less escape from Impel Down, Magellan declared. Well, check again pal. Usopp called tauntingly. I can't wait to see him knock you down a few pegs. If he doesn't kill Luffy first, Robin reminded him. How can you say something like that so calmly? He cried at her. That's terrible. That's a cowardly move anyway, Zoro snarled. Magellan should at least fight without his powers. That's just low to use something like that. Straw Hat Luffy, your luck has finally run out, Magellan declared. After capturing you, I'll take my time with you and learn just how you managed to break in here. No, Sanji cried in panic. If they learn that my sweet goddess Hancock helped him, then he trailed off, unable to imagine what they might end up doing if they found out what she did. He felt anger boiling in the pit of his stomach when he thought about how she smuggled Luffy in here. He had to fight those feelings of rage, but he still planned to kill Luffy himself for living out such a fantasy. You really think that Luffy will tell him anything? Zoro said, thinking back to all the torture Luffy endured against that Porchemy bastard for a couple kids who didn't even like him. There was no chance that they were gonna get anything out of him here. And his words seemed to be proven true as Luffy's eyes narrowed and he declared, I'll die before telling you that. I wonder if Luffy-san was also taken in by her. Brook sighed, thinking dreamily of Hancock for a moment. I think that it's more innocent than that, Robin said, a smile on her face for a fraction of a second. But that's not the issue here. Magellan smirked horribly, as if imagining doing something horrible and said, before we torture them, all the prisoners say that. But then again, Straw Hat, what you're about to experience is nothing as pleasant as torturing. What does he mean by that? Chopper cried out, gulping down as he felt sweat falling from his face. You think that they're gonna go easy on him after everything that's happened? Nami asked, fear in the pit of her stomach as she wondered just what kind of horrors they would do to Luffy. He broke into Impel Down, beat up a load of guards, and did a lot of damage to this place. There's no chance that they'll let him off easy for all that. She thought of the other floors and shivered as she realized that must be regular torture in their eyes. For the love of all that's good, she hoped that Luffy managed to escape from this. Straw Hat, Bon Clay shouted, Magellan's whole body is poisonous. You'll be in huge trouble if you so much as touch him. Do you really think you stand a chance against a man like that? Hell, and Luffy only fights with his fists, Sanji said, going pale at the thought. How can he fight him if he can't even touch him? Usopp cried out. That's the point. He can't, Robin whispered. He's got no choice but to run. But they all knew Luffy well enough to know that there was no chance of him running away. I'll win, Luffy declared firmly. Bon Clay shook his head and shouted out, go back to the cauldron of blood where we were before and take a right. Straw Hat, just give up on the food and let's make a run for it to level 5. I agree, Usopp cried out, hoping that for once he could hear his words. There's no way you can fight him, Luffy. That won't work, Magellan informed them. The stairway to level 5 is being guarded by a head jailer and the other 3 demon guards. Bon Clay gasped as the Straw Hats all now started to feel panic seeping in. You mean there are 3 more like the Minotaurus? Chopper cried out. They did say that there were 4 of them in all, Frankie reminded him. And this head jailer guy doesn't sound like someone you wanna mess with. We've already sealed off all the escape routes from this floor, Magellan stated. No matter where you try to run, you can't escape. Oh no, Brook said, and if he had eyes, they would be popping out of his head. You mean there's no way out? How is Luffy-san supposed to get out of this? No, Bon Clay cried out, backing away. No way, what's he doing now? Usopp screamed and suddenly Magellan's entire body was covered in the purple poison, now looking as if he had been dumped into a vat of jelly or something. Ah, he means business now, Usopp screamed in horror. He's using the Hydra again. Frankie shrieked. The poison leaked from his body in heavy clumps, and to their dread they saw that a dragon head, dripping death as they went, rose up and surrounded Luffy. It hovered there, slithering like a snake as Luffy stared around at them. What is that? Luffy cried out in shock. Is all that poison? Well, it's not cotton candy now, is it? Sanji yelled. Get out of there, you idiot. The dripping head struck at Luffy and Bon Clay, forced to jump away as the heads tried to bit down on them both. Luffy dodged it easily, but they watched in terror as he held up his fist, ready to strike back. No, don't do it, Chopper cried out in terror. Gum gum, pistol. He screamed and attacked, but to their relief, Bon Clay charged ahead, and took the hit himself. Thank God that there's somewhere with a brain. Nami gasped, wiping her brow with her hand and giving a silent, thank you, to Bon Clay for taking that hit to protect Luffy. Straw Hat, he croaked out, his eyes watering in pain from where he fell on the ground. Bon Clay, Luffy asked, not believing what he was seeing before Bon Clay jumped up and tackled him to the ground, rolling in circles across the floor and away from Magellan. Now that he's stopped him, they need to get out of there. Usopp cried, hoping that Luffy would listen to reason just this once. What are you doing, Bon Clay? Luffy screamed at him furiously. Like I said, that won't work. Bon Clay shouted back as he shook him hard and even poked him in the head as if hoping that would help get the message across. If you get soaked in it, or even touch it, you're gone. You can say that, but how am I supposed to fight him if I can't even touch him? Luffy demanded. That's the point, Luffy. Usopp yelled out. You can't win. Do you want to be poisoned to death? Since when has the fear of death ever stopped that moron before? Sanji demanded harshly, but he was already halfway through smoking this cigarette and had a bad feeling that he might run out of more smokes before this night was over. Like I said, you can't fight him. Bon Clay cried out, anger and fear in his eyes. No way, Luffy shouted, refusing to believe it. Can't I do anything here? You can run. That's all you really can do here, pal. Frankie shouted. He hated having to run from a fight, but rather than certain death, right. Behind you guys. Zoro yelled, cursing himself worse than ever for being miles away on another island while this was happening. Bon Clay, thankfully, noticed the Hydra's head as well and kicked Luffy out of the way in the nick of time. The Hydra's head crashed into the floor and there was dust kicked up all over. Luffy. Usopp croaked out anxiously, Bon Clay. They watched with bated breath as the smoke cleared, and when they did, they saw that Luffy was still standing there, but there was a second Luffy dancing around like a ballet dancer. Bon Clay transformed. Chopper cried out excitedly. Do you think that they can use that to escape? I doubt it, Zoro said seriously. Bon Clay's still wearing that jumpsuit. I don't think that disguise will fool Magellan for long, if at all. Bon Clay whispered to Luffy to make an escape while he distracted Magellan and his Hydra. He then began to shout at Magellan, trying to draw his attention, but it was clear to everyone that the warden wasn't fooled. I told you it's useless, Magellan said darkly as more poison began to seep from his body. Don't you understand? And just like that, he sprouted out 2 more dragon heads to join the first so that the 3-headed beast was complete. He has more of them. Luffy cried out as the Bon Luffy yelled out in fear. They're made of poison, and he can create poison, so I'm guessing he can make as many as he wants, Sanji said darkly. It is called the Hydra, and it usually does have more than 1 head, Robin said. And according to legend, if you cut off one of its heads, 2 more would grow in its place. Again you aren't helping, Robin. Usopp yelled at her. The 3 heads swirled around gracefully before they struck like snakes. Luffy and Bon Clay had no choice but to start running, and they followed closely behind, wondering just what they were gonna do to get out of this mess. The Hydra gave chase, but to their shock, one of the heads ended up swallowing up 2 of the prison guards so that when they hit the ground they were covered the purple gunk and screaming in agony. What in the? Brook gasped, unable to believe what he was seeing. What's he doing to his own allies? Luffy yelled out. The Hydra's made of a paralyzing nerve potion. Bon Clay explained as they ran. Excruciating pain spreads through entire body and eventually kills you. That's horrible. Brook screamed out. He can't do that to his own allies. I think he just did. Sanji reminded him. Damn, do all people who work for the government believe in collateral damage? He suddenly was reminded of Enies Lobby and how those bastards opened fired on their own ship, who had 1,000 of their own soldiers on board. All for the chance to kill one pirate. Nami was right, and it wasn't just because of her beautiful face. Being a pirate is more humane than working for the world government. A guard gasped as a poisoned one crawled toward the warden, reaching his hand out, pleading for help as Magellan walked by, still dripping poison everywhere. Help, me. It hurts, hurry. Give me the antidote. Robin blinked. So there is an antidote that can cure them. But as the men begged for help, the guards who were lucky enough to avoid the poisoning were backing away from them, terrified of being touched. But the worst was Magellan as he walked by. He looked down at them with no guilt or remorse on his face and merely said, "Don't get in the way of my attacks, fools. You can't do that to your own men." Brook yelled out, reaching for his own sword, and ready to strike, at least until Zoro put a hand on his shoulder to silently remind him that he was wasting his breath by yelling. But, Zoro-san, I know, he said seriously, closing his one eye. It sucks, this whole thing does. But there's nothing we can do. Brook looked at him before he glared at Magellan in rage. He couldn't stand it when someone disregarded the lives of others, especially when they were their own allies. He knew better than anyone what it was like to take life for granted. He had died once and was lucky enough to be given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. So when he saw someone treat something as precious as life as if it was nothing, he couldn't stand it. It were people like them who he hated most. How can he do that? Nami yelled, on Brook's side. It's his fault that he poisoned them. Please forgive us, sir," said one of the guards. "They've done nothing to apologize for." Chopper cried out, tears in his eyes at the thought of not being able to help them. He's the one who should be sorry. But then the Hydra heads went back to chasing after Luffy again, who, to their amazement, was chanting how hungry he still was. "You've still got your appetite even now?" Bon Clay demanded in shock as the rest of them felt sweat drops again to hear something so random. "You're definitely not normal, Straw Hat. That's what we've all been saying since we met him," Nami gasped, shaking her head and wishing that she could just hit Luffy here for worrying about something so stupid when there were other things that he should be worrying about. Still, it might be impossible for us to run from Magellan. Bon Clay cried just as Luffy hopped up onto the railing and stretched his arms out to grab onto a rafter over the cauldron. Luffy was crying out in pain and they could see that just holding onto the thing was burning his hands. But Luffy ignored that as he turned his head around and shouted, "Try following me." He jumped swinging downwards, but they saw that he was too close to the fire already. "Swing up you idiot," Nami screamed in terror. "No, I get it," Zoro yelled out as Luffy did eventually swing upwards, his shirt burning after getting so close to the flames. He was calling out in pain at how hot it was, but he succeeded in his plan for when they all looked up. "Yes," Usopp cried out in joy when they saw the fire burning the poison up. One of the heads was destroyed in the fire. "I doubt that'll be the end of it though." Zoro frowned, knowing that Magellan could always make more if they were right about his powers. "Yes," Luffy said as he put out the fire on his clothes. "I destroyed one of the heads. Magellan was looking up at him with new interest. "I'd expect no less from Ace's brother," he confessed. "You've got talent, I'll give you that. But this is as far as you'll be able to go." That was when they noticed that he seemed to be chewing something like bubble gum. But before anyone could figure out what he had planned this time, he blew what looked like a light blue bubble from his mouth before he spat it at Luffy, or more rather the flames that he was standing over. "Chloro ball," Magellan said, and they saw the bubble explode into a large fireball when it came in contact with the heat. "Chloro. No," Chopper cried out, realizing what this was. It was poison gas. Luffy beat poison gas before though, remember? Frankie cried out, thinking back to Amazon Lily when he just blew away Marigold's poison. Yeah, but back then he was still able to at least touch them. He can't even do that much here. Nami cried out as Chopper and Usopp covered their mouths from the gas. "Sooner or later you'll remember that nothing can affect us here," Robin reminded them, and they both started to breathe normally again. But Luffy wasn't as lucky, for they heard him cry out in pain, and when the gas cleared enough for them to see, they saw him standing across from them, sneezing and rubbing his eyes. "What the hell's going on?" Luffy yelled out. "My eyes won't stop watering and I can't stop sneezing. I can't fight like this. I can't see anything. He's blind." Brook gasped. "Either way, he needs to move now." Zoro shouted as the Hydra heads reared up, only feet from Luffy. But then, to their shock, they watched as the Hydra slowly stopped and halted right in front of him. "What's going on? He's helpless now," Sanji cried out in confusion. Magellan seemed keen to finish Luffy off before. "What's he waiting around for?" "Huh," Luffy cried out, still sneezing violently. "What happened?" The dragon stopped. They looked to Magellan, and they saw that he had completely coated himself in poison. "Venom Road," Magellan cried out, and just like that, he seemed to swim through the Hydra's body like he was in some kind of tube before he reached one of the Hydra's mouths and leapt out so that he was back in front of Luffy. He then pulled off the two horns on the top of his head, and some of them were relieved to see that they weren't real, and there was even a hint of laughter when they saw the pigtails that the fake horns were hiding. Not that it lasted long, for Magellan put the horns on his hands like a pair of gloves. "It doesn't matter how hard you struggle," Magellan declared. "You won't ever leave this place." And with vicious swipes, he went after Luffy, who was still trying to recover from the gas. He kept backing away, forced to duck and dodge to avoid getting skewered. "That's low," Brook cried out, all of them running around to try to get closer to see what was going on. Luffy-san said he can't see. And the memory showed that it had darkened slightly and everything around them seemed to have become blurry and difficult to focus on. "If you think you can touch me, go ahead and try." Magellan cried out, about to strike, and he drove his horn glove right at Luffy. They watched as Luffy ducked, missing death by less than an inch. But there was a slight explosion and a horrible fizzling sound from where Magellan struck the wall. When the dust cleared up, they saw that Magellan had actually melted the stone wall so that it looked no different than the little wax doll that Mr. 3 had tried to make up on level 3 before it melted. He melted the rock. Chopper cried out, eyes wide. "He's not playing around," Sanji said seriously. "He doesn't care if he brings Luffy in dead or alive, so long as he stops him." "I thought that they were supposed to bring him in and question him as to how he got in here." Usopp cried out. "I don't think that Magellan really cares about that anymore," Zoro said, grinding his teeth so hard together that he knew he must have cracked at least a couple. "He just wants Luffy to suffer for daring to break in here in the first place." Luffy slid down to the foot of the melted wall, and stared up through bloodshot and watery eyes. Though it was impossible to tell if that was from the poison or if he was actually close to crying. They could understand if it was either case. He started to cough and sneeze again, trying to get the poison out of his system, as Magellan looked down darkly. "You will not escape again," he promised. But, as they expected, Luffy pushed himself up as he gasped for air. "I have to save Ace." "You can't help him if you don't save yourself first, Luffy," Nami called. "You've got to focus on getting away from that guy and then worry about what to do after." "Where's he supposed to go?" Frankie demanded. "You heard him. All the ways on this floor are blocked off and the freaking devil himself doesn't look like he's gonna move anytime soon." In the end, Magellan said, pulling his arm out of the melted wall, "You and your brother Ace." He pulled back and jumped down so that he had Luffy cornered. "We'll suffer the same fate." "Not on our watch," Brook declared harshly. "You tell him, Brook." Usopp cheered. "Yow, if we were real we'd show you," Frankie shouted, pointing his guns at Magellan's face, now longing for an attack. "Damn, where's Bon Clay when you need him? Where is he anyway?" "Yeah, he was helping Luffy out before," Chopper added, glancing round for their friend. "Down there," Robin said, pointing below to where Bon Clay was hiding behind one of the stone columns, and his face seemed torn about what he should do. He clearly looked like he wanted to help, but he seemed at a loss at how to do so. "Don't just stand there. Do something," Nami yelled at him, but to their amazement, tears in his eyes, Bon Clay turned and ran down the pathway and out of sight. "Be Bon Clay," Chopper cried out in shock, his eyes wide. "You mean he just ran away?" Usopp yelled, pulling at his hair. "This is the same man who gave up his own freedom to save you before." Frankie asked in shock, unable to believe what he was seeing. I can't say I'm happy about that, Robin said grimly, but the sad truth is I don't see how there was anything he could do to help. He fights with kicks. He can't touch Magellan any more than Luffy can. But Bon Clay would never abandon Luffy. Chopper yelled, refusing to believe that their friend would run out on Luffy after all that happened. Not like this. No, he's got to be doing something to help. So you tell me what he's supposed to do. Sanji demanded harshly, suddenly wishing that he kicked that bastard harder when he fought him back at Alabasta. The others weren't faring much better. Brook just stared with his jaw open wide as Usopp fell to his knees, unable to believe that something like that happened while Zoro's hand twitched, as if itching to pull out his sword and kill someone. They were all furious that Luffy was now on his own, but at the same time, they couldn't completely bring themselves to hate Bon Clay. Not that it stopped them from glaring at Bon Clay's retreating back, however they had more important things to worry about at the moment. Magellan was delivering deadly blow after deadly blow, and it was all Luffy could do just to avoid getting caught by those horns. At one point, Luffy caught the side of the glove, careful that only his sandal touched him, just as the sharp point was mere inches from his face. He then kicked at Magellan's hand to the ground to avoid it, but this caused the stone beneath their feet to crack and break apart. With a loud crashing and banging, the entire structure was falling apart and the bricks were tumbling downwards towards the fire, along with Luffy. Luffy! Sanji shouted as the more sensitive members of the crew screamed and covered their eyes. You've gotta catch yourself. You fall in there, and you're toast. Luffy didn't need the warning however, for he knew full well what would happen if he let himself fall. Gum gum, stamp. He screamed out, stretching his leg out and stamped against a wall, using it to rebound and land on one of the lower walkways. They sighed in relief at the sight of it, at least until they noticed that he was already panting for air when he landed hard on his back and didn't immediately get back up. What's wrong, Luffy? Usopp called fearfully. He's taken on a lot of damage, but he's been able to stand up after way worse, Frankie hissed, thinking of all the battles he's had up until now. He's too tired. Nami cried out. He fought his way through all those other levels just to get even this far and now he's fighting against someone who's slowly killing him. Where are the others? Chopper cried out, still holding on to the hope that Bon Clay would come through for them in the end. You think that Buggy and the three guy will risk their lives for him? Sanji yelled out furiously. Well, what about Bon Chan? Brook cried out desperately. I'm sure he wants to, Robin said, biting her lower lip. And I know that if there's a chance that he can help, he will. But right now, he's on his own, Zoro growled bitterly as Luffy was struggling for breath. He can at least try something. Nami cried out, biting her nails as Magellan jumped back over to where Luffy was still panting. He slowly approached, as if he was hoping to draw out this moment of terror. Luffy was on his knees and trying to find his second wind. You still have no intention of giving up? Magellan asked as he came closer. Jerk. Stay away from him. Chopper screamed out, wanting to run out there and fight himself. But Luffy was forcing himself to get up to his feet, but had to hold onto the floor to keep himself from falling over. He didn't answer at first, but then he snarled, I'll break Ace free and then get out of here. His hand became a fist as he moved to his horse stance and they suddenly recognized the position he was in. Nami's eyes widened as she cried out, you mean he's gonna? He is, Zoro said, sweat pouring down his face. Doesn't he realize what's going to happen? Chopper screamed out in terror. This isn't gonna be like when he fought Crocodile's scorpion poison. He knows, Sanji said, his cigarette falling from his mouth. He just doesn't care. There's no way I'm gonna die before I get to him. Luffy stated as he pumped the blood through his legs. I won't let Ace be executed. But he can't do this. Chopper screamed out as Luffy's body burned red and the steam began to billow out. What's with this steam? Magellan demanded, and for the first time, he looked rather taken aback by what he was seeing. Luffy stood tall as he said, if I'm doomed to lose because you're poisonous and I can't touch you. He stared down at his hands for a moment, as if he'd never seen them before he glared up at Magellan and declared, then I'd rather touch you and give up my arms to beat you. Luffy, Nami whispered, covering her mouth, unable to believe that he had just said that. That's just like him, Zoro whispered as Magellan held up his fist, still dripping with poison. If you don't want your arms, he said softly, then I'll grant your wish and take them. No Luffy. Usopp, Chopper and Brook all cried out as Luffy stretched out both of his arms behind him. But Luffy was far past reason, he had given into desperation and was now resorting to desperate measures. They couldn't stop him now and all they could do was watch. Gum, Guam, Jet, Bazooka. Luffy screamed and they watched, as if in slow motion, as Luffy finally landed a doubt-fisted punch right to Magellan's stomach. The blast was so strong that they could feel the tremor and it finally sent Magellan to his knees, coughing up poison and blood. Luffy no. Chopper screamed. If Magellan was in bad shape, Luffy was in even worse, panting hard, they saw the damage that he had done to himself. His hands were covered in so much of that purple junk that it looked like he was wearing gloves. Usopp whispered. Magellan may have been brought down to his knees, but as for Luffy, poison was dripping off his hands and onto the floor like blood. Reckless, Sanji whispered harshly, watching Luffy's face screwed up in terrible agony. That was when he too fell to his knees again and was screamed in pain. "Ah, this is bad, really bad," Chopper screamed as Luffy fell to his face, writhing in pain, trying to push himself back up, but the poison was eating away at his hands like acid. "If he doesn't get the antidote he'll die for sure." "Is there an antidote?" Usopp cried out. "I don't know," Chopper cried out, not having the slightest idea of how to help. Without being there and testing the poison himself, there wasn't anything he could offer to help in the situation. "Magellan!" Brook cried out and they looked up in time to see Magellan getting to his own feet. Breathing hard, he glared down at Luffy, seemingly unable to speak for a moment. But then he found his voice as he said harshly, "To think you could bring me to my knees. A wild animal is a frightening thing when cornered. No matter, the poison covering your arms will be more than enough to kill you." "No!" Brook yelled out, pulling out his sword, ready to fight. There was no chance that he was going to let Luffy-san die on his watch. "There's no point," Frankie yelled, though tears were in his eyes. "Damn it, this is torture just standing here watching." "There's nothing we can do," Robin whispered, her head down. "This already happened. Doesn't mean we have to like it." Usopp yelled out furiously. More poison just continued to drip from Luffy's hands as Magellan said, "It'll rob you of your strength little by little. You're suffering now, aren't you? How shameful. Fight like a man and use your own strength." Sanji cried out, wishing that he could set fire to this guy already. "If you think it's so shameful, then how about you stop fighting with poison already?" Luffy was panting hard, as if just breathing had become a painful task for him. But Magellan's words seemed to light a fire in him as he staggered back to his feet. Screaming in anger or pain, they had no idea, but they knew that he was far from giving up. "You're still not done," Magellan demanded. "Luffy doesn't give up even when he should," Frankie said, but worry still in his stomach as Luffy threw his arms back for a second time. "Gum, gum," Luffy began before he rammed his hands in to hit Magellan's stomach once again. Twin, jet pistol. But that attack just seemed to make Magellan even angrier than before. He looked bad as he took a deep breath and said, "Poison blowfish." "Blowfish," Usopp repeated at a loss. "Blowfish are poisonous if you don't prepare them right," Sanji couldn't help but say as Magellan began to inflate his body slightly while he then spat out poisonous liquid bubbles from his mouth. Luffy was able to jump out of the way, missing them over and over as Magellan continued to spit them, at one point spraying the floor with a rain of poison balls. "Can't he do something other than spit?" Sanji demanded hotly as Luffy jumped around Magellan. Though he hadn't been touched by any of those poisonous balls, the fumes he was breathing in was clearly starting to take a toll on him. But he cocked his arm back anyway, shouting out, "Gum gum." But Magellan spotted him in time, and turned around to send one of the Hydra's heads right at him. "Luffy, no!" Frankie yelled, but too late. "Jet pistol." Luffy finished and stuck. Though he managed to succeed in destroying the Hydra's head, more poison was splattered, covering more of his body. Luffy managed to jump away from Magellan, but he stumbled more than ever, the memory around them growing dark. "Wait," Usopp cried. "The memory's fading." "No," Robin said, staring at Luffy. "He's having trouble seeing. He's losing his sight." Chopper screamed out. "Poison does that to you? He's just being poisoned to death out there." Luffy was coughing as they suddenly heard a strange hissing sound around them and were looking around to try and find it. That was when they noticed the thickening haze that was building up around them. "Mist," Luffy muttered, looking around. "Where'd this come from?" Frankie demanded, staring at the purple stuff. "No look," Brook cried, pointing at Magellan. "The fog is coming from him." And he was right, this strange purple haze was coming from Magellan's breath, forming a thick cloud around Luffy that formed into a huge spider. "Poison cloud," Magellan exclaimed as the haze began to spin around Luffy. Chopper screamed, tears falling as he watched Luffy try to fight it off. He was coughing worse than ever and actually started to spit up blood as the toxin burned his lungs. "It is pointless," Magellan called to him. "This poison is a part of me. It's a living being. He's mad," Nami whispered, and suddenly everything around them was going blurry. Everything around them started spinning, stretching, changing around, as a terrible ringing was going off in all directions. "Is your eyesight turning blurry yet?" Magellan's voice called through the ringing. "Are your ears ringing?" Magellan's face was becoming twisted and warped, showing just how bad a shape Luffy was in. Everything was mixing together to such a point that it was getting to be almost impossible to try and make out what was happening. But they could make out enough to see Luffy had jumped into the air and had inflated himself. Just like what happened on Amazon Lily, he was about to blow the poison all away. But Chopper was biting hard on his hooves. He knew that the damage had been done. He's badly poisoned and all this jumping around was only making the poison speed up even faster than before. He didn't know anything about how Magellan's powers worked, but he did know that there were very specific kinds of poisons and antidotes used to cure them. If Luffy takes in too much more toxins, then there's no way that he could think of a way to save him. A normal person would have dropped over dead already from the amount that Luffy had already taken in. Luffy had been able to blow the gas away, but this time, when he landed, he didn't seem to be able to get back to his feet. He was now struggling to breathe and the Straw Hats were all trying to cheer him on, telling him either to get up and run, or to figure out a way to fight back and teach this guy a lesson. But what they saw next sent a cold chill through their bodies. "I keep telling you it's pointless," Magellan called. "Don't you get it?" And to their horror, he called the poison gas back simply by breathing out once again. That's when everything around them started to go. They could hardly see anything anymore and the ringing was almost deafening. Luffy gasped out, his whole body was shaking and he was struggling just to breathe. "No matter how hard you struggle," Magellan told him, "there's no escape for you." "Oh, please someone stop this," Usopp cried, holding his ears against the terrible sound. "I can't take it. Both hands must be totally useless by now." Magellan's voice sounded from somewhere in this whirlwind of sound and shapes. "The poison will take everything from you before long." Everything was darkening, and slowly, Luffy fell face forward onto the stone, laying there as limp as a rag doll. "No!" Nami, Usopp, Brook, and Sanji all yelled as Chopper and Frankie cried out in terror, thinking the worst. "Luffy, you've gotta get back up!" Usopp yelled out, hoping that Luffy could hear him just this once. "You've never thrown the towel in with anything in your life, you can't start now. This isn't like you," Nami yelled when Chopper ran over to him, but with the memory close to blacking out, he couldn't tell how severe the damage was, though you didn't need to be a doctor to see how serious Luffy's condition was. Magellan's footsteps echoed around them and they looked up to see that he had stopped right in front of Luffy before he gave him a look of true disgust. He then turned and was now leaving. But to their dread, Luffy was already pushing himself back to his feet, looking ready to fight once again. "Luffy, stop!" Chopper yelled desperately. "Your body can't take any more abuse. Any more poison and you'll die for sure. You'll kill yourself. You don't know when to quit," Magellan said, turning back to him with annoyance on his face. "Do you really want to save your brother that badly?" "It's his brother. Of course he does," Nami yelled, tears in her eyes as the others made a wall between him and Luffy, though they might as well be made of air for all the good it was. Luffy was beating his head against the stone, trying to clear his vision. But he managed to get to his feet and charged at him, his eyes wild and dangerous. "It'd be easier for you to just lie down and shut your eyes," Magellan said when Luffy aimed another pistol at him. But Luffy's aim was shaking so badly that he missed his mark completely. Magellan then grabbed Luffy's arm and sent him swinging over his head like a lasso before he slammed him right into the stone floor. At this point, everyone was wishing that the memory would just black out already. This was torture to watch and be so helpless. It was only made worse when Luffy was pushing himself back to his feet. At the sight of it, Magellan seemed to lose whatever patience he had left. "Stupid fool," he sneered at Luffy, "why would you go this far? Portgas D. Ace is a felon sentenced to death. And you're the intruder who's trying to rescue him. I will not forgive any sin. How is wanting to save your brother a sin?" Usopp demanded loudly. Fire Fist's fated death at Marineford has long since been set in stone. Magellan declared and they all felt cold at his words since they knew what was to happen. "There's nothing you can do about it." "Shut up," Luffy screamed, aiming another punch at him, but they knew that he was no longer able to even see straight as his punches were miles off. "You're only hurting yourself," Magellan informed him. "Gum gum, stamp." Luffy stretched his leg out, but his aim was so far off that he missed Magellan completely and his foot ended up going straight into the fire. "He needs to stop this." And it was surprisingly Robin who shouted this time as Luffy screamed in pain and tried to put the fire out. "He really will kill himself if this goes on much longer." "That's quite enough, isn't it?" Magellan asked, and he was sounding bored this time. "You shut up." Usopp yelled but stopped when he watched Magellan's eyes wide in shock. Usopp spun around and saw the reason for this surprise. Luffy had miraculously made it back to his feet once more and had shifted into his second gear a second time, ready for one last desperate attempt. "Luffy, stop, please," Nami cried out as Magellan called forth the 3 dragon heads, and prepared them to strike. "This is it," Zoro said, grinding his teeth again. "One of them is going to lose this fight." Luffy seemed to have lost all common sense as he leapt straight for the Hydra's mouths. All they could hear was his desperate scream. "Give Ace, ba ACCCCCCCCK." And that was as they watched him being swallowed by the Hydra. Time seemed to freeze around them and all they were aware of next was seeing Luffy lying in a pool of poison. No one could say a word as they stared, stunned and in shock at what had just happened. Magellan stood over Luffy's defeated body, who was now completely drenched in the poison. His eyes were wide and unseeing as his mouth was open as if he was trying to scream but couldn't remember how. "This is your punishment," Magellan stated, ice in his voice. "After exposure to this much poison, no antidote will save you, you will agonize for 24 hours, and then descend to the real hell." "And no, that can't be." Chopper croaked as he fell to his knees. But he knew it to be true. He knew that if someone had been poisoned it could be cured with the right antidote, but if they suffer from more than one type of poison at the same time, any ailments given to them would just make them die sooner. Which meant, Luffy shouldn't have survived. "That's not true. It can't be true," Brook cried out, looking at the others for support. But no one was able to answer, all of them shocked to the core at what they had just seen. Ace, Luffy choked, the poison oozing off of his body and some of it dripping into his mouth, and that was when the memory darkened around them, leaving them staring at the faraway darkness. I can't believe he did that, Nami whispered, shaking her head. How the hell was Luffy not dead from all that? When they got back, she was going to kill him for doing something so stupid. But Magellan was wrong though. Usopp said, shaking himself from his stupor as he tried to stand on his shaky legs, but seemed to have trouble remembering how to do so. Luffy's just fine. He survived all that poisoning. I don't see how. Chopper cried out, tears falling before he started to cry outright. What's wrong? Frankie yelled at him, I'm not complaining. Luffy survived and that's all that matters, right? But I don't see how it's possible. Chopper sobbed out. Even for Luffy, he was hit by several dozen different types of poison. No antidote could save him. Wait, what do you mean no antidote could save him? Zoro demanded at once, refusing to believe a piece of crap like that. I mean, if Luffy had been hit with one or two, they might have been able to give him an antidote for it. Chopper yelled back, but with that much poison, and dozens of them mixed together, any antidote for one of them they try to give him will just kill him faster. Kill him faster, Sanji demanded, lost as to what was going on. Then what the hell? Luffy shouldn't still be alive after all that, Chopper whispered as tears flooded from his eyes. It shouldn't be possible. What are you talking about? He's clearly alive. Usopp yelled at him. I don't know. None of this makes any sense. Chopper had to yell, confusion still in his face. No one could think of anything to say to that as they stared at each other. Now they trusted Chopper's judgment, but none of it was adding up. If what he said was true, then how could Luffy have lived through something like that? They were knocked out of their thoughts when the memory changed suddenly and they had to blink several times to make sure they were seeing it right. They had been expecting to see the inferno again, but rather they were all in a frozen wasteland. There was thick ice and snow covering the floor with icicles hanging from the cages and even an entire forest of pine trees behind them. Where are we? Usopp asked, rubbing his eyes hard to make sure he was seeing right. Look, Robin said, pointing to some men in the cages, all of them in the prison jumpsuits. They look to be half frozen. Since this is still obvious impel down, I'm guessing that this must be level 5. Out of the frying pan and into the freezer, Sanji said, glaring around in disgust. Just when I thought that it can't get any worse. Level 5 is the level where criminals with bounties of 100 million and over are kept, Robin said grimly. I think I get it. In stark contrast to the level above it, the entire level here is a giant freezer. The level is so cold that not only do the prisoners kept here either freeze to death or lose pieces of their flesh from severe frostbite. These prison people just keep getting worse and crueler. Nami cried out, unable to imagine freezing to death in a place like this. You can't last long down here, Chopper whispered. But, hold on, if this is level 5, it's nothing like the place that we saw Ace before. Then it looks like we were right and that it turns out there are more than 5 floors, Robin said at once. At least 6. Hey, one of the prisoners shouted out. Check it out. A new one got thrown down here. They all spun around, knowing at once who the new one would be. Some jailers were there, wrapped up in coats and dragging a sled behind them. Almost too afraid to look, they stood and watched as Luffy was dragged past them, still looking just like in the last memory. There was so much of the purple gunk covering Luffy's body that they couldn't tell if he was even conscious anymore, but he looked as if he was trapped and trying to remember how to scream. Luffy, Usopp croaked out as he felt tears coming to his eyes. The prisoners all moved closer to the bars, asking who he was and how much his bounty was. At least until they saw his condition. Oh, wait, said one of the inmates. It's too late for him. He received the poison punishment. They followed after the sled as the guards brought him to a particularly large cell where several half-frozen prisoners were already sitting in. Some of the guards held their guns up, ready to fire should someone try to escape. The prisoners backed away from the bars as they unlocked the door. And to the Straw Hats' fury, they merely dumped the sled and rolled Luffy inside like he was just a log or some piece of garbage. None of them moved again as Luffy rolled a few feet inside the cell, with the inmates backing away from his poisoned body and the guards left, leaving the sled there, and staying only long enough to lock the cell. So they're just gonna leave him here? Sanji yelled in outrage. Does it really surprise you? Robin asked quietly. After everything we've seen here. But at that moment Luffy started screaming. They jumped at the sudden sound and watched as he let out terrible agonized screams, followed by wheezing and gagging as he tried to breathe. Luffy just laid on the frozen floor, coughing up blood from his lungs that made gargling sounds, meaning that they were filling up with blood. Soon he began to writhe in pain on the floor as the poison was being absorbed into his skin. I can't watch him suffer like this. Nami cried out, covering her eyes and turning away, though she could still hear Luffy's tortured cries. If they love people suffering so much, you wait until I get hold of them. I'll show them suffering, those sick bastards, Sanji said, trying to light up another cigarette, though his hands were shaking so much that he couldn't get the stupid lighter to work. This is just torture. Brook cried out, and they weren't sure if he was talking about letting Luffy like this, or about them merely able to watch. "We've got one unusual fellow here," said one of the other inmates who Luffy happened to be sharing the cell with. "They need us to give them his time of death or something. You bastards aren't helping." Frankie yelled at him as Luffy rolled onto his stomach and tried to move. "Luffy, don't," Nami tried to stop him as she bent down next to him to gently push him down, only to see her hands go right through him like smoke. It hurts." Luffy choked out more blood as he screwed up his eyes in pain, his entire body shaking. Brook had tears falling from his empty sockets, knowing the terrible pain all too well, how being so badly poisoned felt like he was being burned alive and how even the slightest breath caused him terrible pain. Luffy was trying to get to his feet, but collapsed to all fours, his head nearly touching the snow as he tried to regain control. But his body was no longer obeying him. "I can't stand this," Chopper cried out, looking ready to rip off his own antlers from how frustrated he was. "I'm a doctor and I can't do anything to help him." But he knew that even if he was there wouldn't have been anything he could do to save Luffy. Luffy was already too far gone to be saved by anything that he knew. All he could do was to give his captain something that could ease his pain. "Damn it," Usopp cried, tearing at his own hair. "While I was stuffing my face on the Blown Isles, he was here in hell like this. What kind of friend am I?" He felt so sick and ashamed of himself for what he was doing. All he cared about was eating, and he got fat while Luffy was in some prison and going through this. "Some crew we are," Frankie said in agreement, thinking about how stupid he was acting from that tea while he was away. "I mean, what kind of crew isn't anywhere near their captain when he needs them? We might as well have just walked right out on him for all the good that we were." A part of him wished that at least one of the others would counter those, to prove him wrong. But no one did. They all felt the exact same way. They felt like they had really let Luffy down this time, as good as abandoned him, and it was only made worse when Luffy made another attempt to stand up. And this time he managed to do so, but his body swayed dangerously as he stumbled to the bars and banged his head against them so hard that he fell back to the floor, wheezing and coughing worse than ever. "He's going to kill himself," Robin whispered in pain as over and over again. Luffy dragged himself to his feet and bashed his skull against the bars, in a futile attempt to get out. The other inmates merely watched him struggle as blood splattered the snow around them until it was splashed all over with red. "Please change the memory," Chopper yelled, as he and more than half the crew turned away, unable to bear watching Luffy destroy himself like this. "I can't stand to watch this." "What's going to happen though?" Zoro asked, wondering for the millionth time how Luffy could have possibly survived all this. Luffy was coughing worse than ever as he struggled to get to his feet, muttering his brother's name over and over as he hit against the bars one last time, forcing to hold onto the bars to hold himself up. But his grasp was so weak, that he no longer had the strength to even stand and fell once more. "Quit wasting your breath," said a prisoner, who was a giant man in the shape of a chestnut. "After being poisoned that badly, there's no way you'll survive." "Well, he will, and he did." Usopp yelled stubbornly before he stuck his tongue out and yelled, "So there." "That's right," Chopper called out just as angrily. "Leave him alone. You've probably gone blind by now." The man asked. "But you can still hear me, right? Just accept your death." "No way," Luffy shouted defiantly. "I won't die." "Stubborn to the last," Zoro said, a hint of admiration coming back to him, and he was glad for the distraction from the numbing guilt that flooded his mind. Disclaimer: this story do not belong to me. The author is Warm Memories and Brotherly Bonds by RoseDragonWitch. Spluttering up blood worse than ever, Luffy panted, "I refuse to die until I saved Ace." "You wanna save someone else?" another inmate asked incredulously. "You can't even save yourself, you know, they got a friend of yours locked up here or something." "Ridiculous. In this prison you gotta look out for number one. And what good has that gotten you all?" Nami yelled, wishing that she could hit some of these guys. "There's nobody gonna save ya," another said. "Nobody'll ever come to save ya, we're all on our own." "That's not true," Zoro hissed. "Yeah, I swear, if we knew about this, we would have gone bursting right through Impel Down's front doors to get Luffy out of here." Usopp yelled out furiously. "Well said, bro." Frankie cheered, and he would have had the greatest of pleasure using Sunny to go bursting right through those doors. "Get thrown into the sea of fire," said the giant inmate. "You have to step on other prisoners to get back up. If you meet the beasts, you grab whoever's near you and you use them as bait to protect yourself. Try to help someone else and you'll end up as dead yourself. So don't go blabbing some shit about wanting to rescue anyone. You're making me sick. I'll give you sick." Sanji yelled, fire burning his legs. "I'll burn you all to a crisp." Luffy ignored them as he struggled to get back up, but his eyes rolled into the back of his head so that all they could see was whiteness. The memory was dangerously close to fading around them. But just when things were looking hopeless, one of the inmates pointed through the bars. "Hey, look, someone's coming," he said. "It doesn't look like he's a guard or jailer," another said, sounding interested but bored at the same time as if he couldn't care less. "Oh, I hope it's nothing bad," Usopp said, biting his nails as he thought of the jailers coming down here to torture Luffy for information. "What's with that guy? Is he naked or something?" Someone asked and the straw hats blinked, wondering who would be crazy enough to be down here in this freezer with nothing on. I can't make out who he is, Nami whispered, with her and Chopper still crouched next to Luffy who was now shaking from pain and cold. Wait, Frankie said, walking through the bars to try and get a better look. It's a man, wearing nothing but boots and pants while covered in frostbite and blood, staggered towards their cell. Bon Clay, Usopp and Chopper called joyfully. What took him so long? Sanji demanded. What happened to him? He looks like he was attacked by a pack of wolves or something. Nami cried out. He came to help, that's all that matters, Robin said softly as Bon Clay now stood before the bars of the cell. His body seemed frostbitten, and there were open wounds along his body, his nose drippings were frozen solid, but in his hand was a ring of keys. I always knew you were a good guy, Bon Clay-san. Brook called tearfully, grateful that there was someone in this whole place who wanted to help Luffy when they couldn't. Straw Hat, Bon Clay said, shivering and teeth chattering from the cold. I'm here to save you. In the name of our friendship. Bon Clay, I knew that you'd come through. Chopper cried out, but he couldn't stop the tears at the thought of not knowing what to do. He honestly didn't see how there was anything that Bon Clay could do to save Luffy since he wasn't a doctor. But he must have some kind of plan, right? Why else would he come here if he had given up hope for Luffy? The inmates, however, just stared at him as he came closer to them. Who is this guy? Why is he covered in all that blood? Chopper looked closer at the blood on Bon Clay's body and his eyes widened in shock. Those are bite marks, he cried out. Bite marks, Usopp repeated, startled. That must mean that prisoners aren't the only things down on this floor, Zoro said, looking around and expecting some kind of monster to come out and attack. What could live down in this cold? Frankie demanded hotly, I'm freezing just looking at this place. You're practically naked all the time. Sanji snapped, don't complain to me about the cold if you don't even know what pants are. Hey, if you got it, then I say show it off. Frankie said proudly as he posed. But their argument died down as Bon Clay came closer, shivering violently in this bitter cold, but he managed to choke out something. Earlier I'm sorry that I ran. He said, and they could hear the guilt in his voice as Luffy's blank eyes looked up at him, and it was impossible to tell if he even recognized Bon Clay as more blood continued to dribble down from his mouth. The other prisoners just stared in disbelief. How do you know this guy? Asked one of inmates, looking back down to the barely breathing Luffy. I'm his friend, Bon Clay declared, tears in his eyes. Straw Hat, I promise, I'm not gonna let you die. He walked over and knelt down by the cell, we better go now. But how is he going to get him help? Usopp asked, staring at Chopper for some kind of clue as to what to do. But all Chopper could do was shake his head helplessly, truly seeming at a loss. No antidote will be able to work for all that poison, he said as he watched Bon Clay try to put a white key into the keyhole. But his hands were shaking so badly from this cold that he kept missing. Like I said, any antidote will just kill him even faster if they try. Don't say something like that, Usopp yelled as Bon Clay finally got his fingers to work and unlocked the cell. But when he saw Luffy covered in that terrible stuff, he looked around for some way to move him without having to touch it and risk killing them both. He spotted the poison-covered sled that the jailers left behind when they dumped Luffy here, and he went over to pull it in front of the open door as the prisoners all watched, as if they had never seen anything like this before in their lives. Robin, is that really true? Nami asked Robin as Bon Clay carefully helped Luffy to stand, careful to only touch his clothes as he helped him to the sled and he collapsed inside it. I mean, there's got to be some way. There is one way, Robin said softly as Bon Clay dragged the sled behind him and they started to head onwards, wandering deeper into this frozen wilderness. I think I understand, she went on. Bon Clay knew that he didn't stand a chance, so he decided to live and help Luffy later. It really was the only thing he could do, Brook answered softly, having mixed feelings. Though still upset that Bon Clay didn't stay to help Luffy in the first place, he understood why he did what he did, and he did come back to help Luffy-san in the end. If he could help save their captain, then he wouldn't at all hesitate to bow his head low to thank Bon Clay for all that he did. But what way are you talking about, Robin-san? I think that Bon Clay knows the answer to that, she said softly as they followed after him, and it turned out that she was right. The first set of cells that they came to, Bon Clay approached the prisoners and asked if they knew where they could find the person that he had been wanting to meet before, Ivankov. That queen of the drag queens. Usopp repeated in surprise as Robin nodded. Bon Clay called him a miracle man, Chopper said, looking up at her as Sanji's eyes widened as he understood at once what must have happened. I never met him in person, she said, but I do know that as a commander of the revolutionaries, he has control over the lower-ranking members of the army and he does have considerable skills as a leader. According to the rumors, he's been able to save countless lives of those who were considered to be beyond saving. So he must have been the one who saved Luffy here. Nami asked, her eyes wide and the hope slowly began to return. Sanji's eye was twitching horribly at the thought. That bastard was here all this time and he never thought to mention how bad shape that Luffy was in. 2 years he spent in hell, and he was never able to get any kind of information out of Pervert about Luffy or the war. Oh, he made a note to kill him, but he never planned on seeing him again if he could help it. But as Bon Clay continued to drag Luffy behind him, stopping and asking for help from every prisoner who wasn't frozen solid, none of them seemed to be able to tell him anything about how to find this Ivankov. They were all telling him the same things, that he was seen on this floor some time ago, but had long since disappeared. Disappeared, Zoro repeated, looking around. How the hell could someone disappear in the middle of prison and not notice? But the rest of them were more focused on Luffy, who was looking worse the more time that went by. Brook, Chopper, Usopp and Nami were the ones who seemed the most concerned. They were looking over Luffy every few seconds. His skin had turned from that healthy tan to a sickly pale color as he continued struggling just to draw breath. Bon Clay was obviously trying his hardest to find their one hope to saving Luffy, but as time went on, Luffy was continuing to slip away and their concern was mounting. His lungs were filling up with more blood, at least judging from the amount that he was coughing out, and he continued to shake and twist in terrible pain. Eva, repeated a prisoner questioningly when Bon Clay stopped again to ask someone again. How should I know where that queer went? Who the hell are you? They could at least be a little helpful. Nami yelled in frustration. Emporio Ivankov, E.H. inquired another prisoner. Yeah, I remember him. He must be dead, right? Dead. Brook cried out. Oh, he's not, Sanji whispered darkly, trying to ignore the surprised look that the others were giving him. Chopper walked next to the sled, never turning his attention away from Luffy's ever-worsening condition. I don't know what to say but that he's running out of time, and fast. He said, looking up with anxiety in his eyes. Did Magellan say that Luffy had 24 hours before the poison killed him? Frankie asked quickly. So there's still time, right? He said that at the most, Zoro said bitterly. But that doesn't mean that someone can't die before that time is up. If Ivankov doesn't exist, then what is gonna happen to Luffy? Brook whimpered. He obviously lives, so they must have found him. Zoro said stubbornly. The only thing that was keeping him from losing his mind was the fact that he knew Luffy was alright. He is alive, Sanji said, and they looked at him once again before he blurted out, I met that bastard over the last 2 years alright. You did, Nami said in great surprise as he looked down, focused on lighting up another cigarette. Now he had to let them know that he did know that moron, but there was no way he was telling them where he had been. He was going to take that secret with him to the grave, if they ever found out that he had been brainwashed to wear a dress and makeup, acting like a complete idiot, and running around with those people. No, I met him while I trained to get stronger, Sanji said carefully. He's definitely alive. I'm surprised, Sanji, Robin said in interest. What's he like? Just think of it this way, Sanji muttered angrily. Bon Clay's got nothing on this guy when it comes to being a drag queen, and I don't mean that as a compliment. Now I really wanna meet this guy, Frank muttered, eyes wide. But if that's the case, and you did meet him, he must have told you about Luffy. Nami pressed him but Sanji shook his head. He didn't tell me anything, he told her harshly. He didn't believe me when I told him I was part of the crew. He thought that I was some kind of imposter who was after Luffy or something else crazy. Why would he think that? Usopp asked before his eyes widened. The wanted poster. Don't ask, alright, Sanji snapped. The point is I know he's alive and that he survived the war. But he never told me a damn thing about Luffy or anything else no matter what I asked. Sanji, where were you over these last 2 years? Nami asked curiously. I was in hell. That's all that you people need to know. He retorted coldly and he refused to say another word to them about it as they continued to follow Bon Clay as he stopped in front of another cell. Hello, he called to the prisoners inside. I'm looking for someone known as Eva. Could you help? Anyone, please. No one answered him but when they looked in, Usopp turned green as he backed away and Nami gasped, her eyes wide. The men in there were all dead, frozen completely. This really is hell, Brook whispered, falling backward, and staring at the horrible scene. How could anyone allow the government to abuse its power like this? Bon Clay realized that there was no point in asking them anything as he slowly turned, heading off to another set of cages some yards away. Just when it looked like he wasn't going to get anywhere and hope was never looking farther away, Bon Clay finally got a break when an inmate informed him that in the forest there was an abandoned guardroom. That's where he once saw some weirdos lurking around. That's specific, Frankie muttered, but he hung on to that hope, knowing that it was all that they had left. Thank you, Bon Clay called out gratefully as he headed straight off towards the trees without a glance back. Now, most of the Straw Hats were wondering how there was a forest in this place, but then they remembered that there was a forest of bloody trees up on level 1 and just let it go. Their immediate concern was Luffy, for the memory kept fading in and out of focus, showing how dire things were becoming. They stuck close to him as Bon Clay would look back at Luffy once in a while with a deeply worried expression. He kept crying, his tears freezing on his face as he forced himself to keep walking. But it soon got to be so cold that he had to stop to try and blow some hot air onto his hands. If he keeps this up for much longer he'll freeze to death too. Chopper cried anxiously. What was he thinking coming to a place dressed like that? Nami asked, shaking her head. He must have impersonated one of guards to get down here, Robin said, but as to what happened otherwise. She didn't know what else to say to that as Bon Clay suddenly cried out. No, he is the god of all of us drag queens. He then picked the rope back up and said, please, save Straw Hat. If the antidotes can't save him now, falling to his knees, you're the only hope. And I won't give up hoping. I knew I liked him. Brooke cried out as tears fell once again. He is so determined. Most would have given up long ago. But he still believes that this perverted weirdo can save him. Frankie sobbed. You tell him, Bon Clay. Don't you go giving up. Bon Clay pushed himself back up to his feet and forced himself to keep walking as Usopp and Chopper joined Brooke and Frankie in their tearful states. Though the crying was getting annoying to the other Straw Hats, they could understand their desperation all too well. For they were all silently hoping that things would work out for the best. Yet, at that moment Sanji sensed something coming and called out a warning. It came too late, for at that moment, a large pack of wolves, as white as the snow itself with large orange eyes that were full of wild hunger, came out from the trees. Ah! Usopp screamed. Where'd they come from? Looks like we finally know what it was that attacked Bon Clay, Robin said as they came charging in at them. Bon Clay, you gotta get out of there. Chopper yelled, but he knew that the two of them were hopelessly surrounded on all sides by these things and there was no way he could outrun them in their state. Bon Clay realized this as well, for he stood his ground and prepared himself for a fight. He struck one of the wolves in the throat as he kicked another away. But unlike the Cloud Wolves at Skypia, these guys weren't giving up anytime soon. Bon Clay turned into his fighting stance and readied himself for a fight. He was able to beat them away, but then one of the wolves zoomed past him, having spotted Luffy, who was as good as comatose. Luffy! Nami and Usopp screamed as Usopp and Brooke tried to stand in front of the sled. Though they couldn't really attack, it made them feel a little better that they were at least doing something. Oh, no! Bon Clay cried, as he punched and kicked away two wolves to protect Luffy, but they retaliated by biting on his shoulder and ankle. He's outnumbered, Frankie yelled, staring around. He can't hope to fight them all off and protect Luffy at the same time. Not that he didn't try. Ballerina Boy was doing his best to do both, but the wolves weren't giving him any mercy as they kept throwing themselves at him, one after the other. At last, a giant pile on him, all of them fighting for a bite. He's gonna be eaten alive. Usopp screamed, tearing at his face, horrified by all this. But just as it was getting bad, a shadow spread across the ground. Luffy rose up from the sled, his mouth still agape as a horrible rasp came from his throat. Before they noticed this, however, Luffy had bit down on one of the wolves and it howled in pain. They turned to see what had caused it. Luffy! Sanji cried in shock. No! Chopper cried in panic, he shouldn't be up. Luffy held onto the wolf before he spat it out and they scattered for a moment, taken aback by him there. Huh! Bon Clay muttered, staring at Luffy's shadow, and he seemed to be fighting the urge to pass out. But the blood loss he suffered from was clearly taking its toll. Straw! He croaked, looking back at him. What do you all think you're doing to Bon Clay? Luffy questioned in a growl as he looked at the wolves with bloodshot eyes, glaring at them all with such ferocity that they all froze with fear in their tracks. He's scaring me, Chopper whispered, backing away. He had never seen Luffy look like that before. Leave Bon Clay, he choked. Alone. Luffy screamed out and they felt a powerful force burst from him, and like that, the wolves all fell to the snow, out cold. That was. Usopp whispered, his eyes wide. We all know, Zoro whispered softly as Luffy coughed, the poison beginning to overwhelm him and he fell, the memory quickly darkening around them. Straw, Bon Clay gasped, staring at him. What did you, to, them? In his desire to help Bon Clay, he tapped into power he still doesn't realize that he has, Robin whispered softly. But at last, Bon Clay's strength had given out as well and he also collapsed. A cold wind blew over them as Luffy's vision blackened out. But before it did, they heard the unmistakable sound of crunching footsteps in the snow. Someone's coming, Chopper yelled at once. Not guards or jailers, please, Nami whispered. The memory was so out of focus that they couldn't make anything out, but at that moment, they spotted a man's face and he was one of the stranger-looking people they've seen in a long time. He had appeared out of nowhere and was wearing a coat that had orange on one side, while white on the other. The same went for his hair and sunglasses, while on his forehead was some kind of scar that covered his right eye. In one hand he appeared to be holding a glass of wine and held the other out flat at his side. Inazuma. Sanji thought in shock as Luffy blinked and seemed to be forcing himself to try and see clearer. Who's this weirdo? Frankie asked, blinking at him. You're one to talk. Nami snapped, not sure if this was good or bad news yet. The man stepped forward towards them as Luffy's bloody eyes looked up at him. Ivan-kun wishes to see you, he said calmly. He works for Ivankov. Brooke gasped in shock as the memory blackened out completely. I don't get it, Usopp said, not sure what to do. Who was that? Inazuma, Sanji muttered darkly, having negative feelings about that guy as well. I guess you can call him Ivankov's right-hand man. Or drag queen. So, he's here to help? Chopper asked, relief shining in his face. What do you know about this Ivankov guy, Cook? Zoro demanded. I rather not think about him if I can help it, Sanji muttered darkly. But I do know that he's a devil fruit user that can save lives. But, he's also picky about who he does save. What do you mean picky? Nami demanded. I mean, he won't save someone who can't save themselves, he answered. He dislikes people who rely on others to save them and believes that they aren't worth being saved. That's terrible. Brook yelled. I don't know, Zoro shrugged, makes sense to me. Zoro. Chopper yelled, outraged that he could say that. Everyone deserved a chance to be saved if they needed it right. But then he thought of people like the celestial dragons and he was suddenly at a loss. If he had to, could he save one of them? The doctor part of him said yes, of course. But the other half, he gave his head a shake. No, he mustn't think that way. He was a doctor and it was his sworn duty to do whatever it took to save any life. Even if that person might not deserve it. He's a pain in the ass more than anything if you ask me about Ivankov, Sanji muttered as the memory came back and they were in some kind of dark tunnel, surrounded by more bars on all sides. There was still ice and snow around them, but both Luffy and Bon Clay lay on the floor. Luffy was fighting to get up, but seemed to have no strength left to do so as he writhed in pain. While Bon Clay was lying next to him, still covered in blood. No! Chopper cried out, flying to their sides as the rest of them stared in horror. The full pain of the poisoning seemed to be fully setting in and Luffy was quickly losing the fight. They couldn't take their eyes off them for a moment, at least until they heard a single footstep and they looked, and were startled by what they saw. Two people were standing there, one of them was Inazuma, while the other was a very large man with an even larger head sporting a purple afro. He was also wearing so much makeup that it put Bon Clay's cosmetics to shame, and a Jolly Roger tattooed on his chest. While on the top of his head, he wore a crown, which matched his fishnet cape and stockings. He hardly wore anything though if you thought about it. That's Ivankov, Brook asked, not sure what he had been expecting the queen of all drag queens to look like. I guess so, Robin blinked. I had a feeling he would look interesting, I was right. He's a drag queen all right, Usopp said unnecessarily. I'm not sure I trust a guy who looks like that to treat my injuries, Nami said, suddenly doubtful that this is the guy who could save Luffy. But she watched as the two remained silent as they looked at Luffy and Bon Clay. Luffy continued to cough as he tried to roll over in the snow, this time he looked like when he had climbed up the Drum Rockies with Sanji and Nami. "Vi been watching VU2 on the monitors," the drag queen said. "Straw Hat Boy, Vime impressed VU made it this far. Vi can hardly believe how lucky Vi've been." "Lucky in one sense," Zoro muttered as he looked to Luffy's body. "Unlucky in another. Don't just stand there, help them already," Frankie yelled, wanting to hit them for taking their sweet time like this. B, Luffy tried to say, looking up at him from where he lay. Bon Clay, tried to save me, it looked as if every word was painful for him. Beaten by wolves. Please, help him. Ivankov's eyes went wide as they looked at Luffy's simple plea. Please, he's my friend. Luffy gasped out, now twitching and jerking around like he was about to have a seizure. Luffy, Nami whispered, trying to give him some comfort as he lay there. He's loyal if nothing else, Usopp muttered, rubbing his eyes hard as he cried and Robin smiled gently. She wasn't the only one however, for she noticed Ivankov's eyes had also softened when he was asked that request. "We think we might be able to do something for VU after all," he said to him. He walked over and gently opened up Luffy's shirt so that he could see the full damage of the poison and Ivankov frowned at the sight of it. "VU are in bad shape," he said obviously as Chopper went running forward as well, to get a good look. He bit down on his lip when he saw the poison had seemed to merge with his skin, making it look like he had spots. The poison had mostly been absorbed straight into his body and there was nothing that Chopper could think of that could help cure that. "Oh, ya think?" Frankie yelled angrily, wondering why no one was doing anything already. "Don't just stand there. Do something. Straw Hat Boy, we have a treatment that could save VU, Ivankov informed him, and through his glazed eyes, Luffy stared up at him. "Why you can?" he croaked as the others sighed in relief. "Vise," Ivankov answered, but he didn't look too happy about it. "However, the treatment that we have in mind will be so brutal that it may kill VU anyway." "Wait, what?" Nami cried out. "All treatments have their risks," Chopper said nervously, though he wasn't sure he was gonna like this one. Ivankov turned to Inazuma and told him to get Bon Clay fixed up, and his friend nodded in understanding as he took Bon Clay with him down the dark tunnel. Ivankov carefully picked up Luffy and carried him under his arm right after him, but Inazuma soon turned and walked into a separate room while Ivankov took Luffy even deeper. Luffy was fading right before their eyes and the memory kept blacking in and out so that they were only able to get flashes of memory between the darkness. But the memories were misshaped and blurry so that it was almost impossible to make anything out. But they could hear voices around them. "This is the one who broke into Impel Down. Amazing. We were watching on the monitors. Is he gonna be alright? Who are these voices?" Usopp asked, not sure if this was a good or bad thing for them. "So long as they're gonna help Luffy, I don't care," Nami said crossly as the memories were nothing more than a whirlwind of sound and dark colors. "Get a room set up for him. They heard Ivankov's voice rang out. You mean, he's gonna go through that? I don't like the way they said that, Brooke said timidly as the memories were all confusing and the ringing in their ears was back. The sound kept fading and getting louder before fading again while the memories were so mixed up that it was impossible to tell up from down anymore. But at last they heard Ivankov's voice telling Luffy that he needed to wake up now, and at the sound of the voice, the memory slowly came back into focus enough for them to see what was going on. Though when it did, they wished that they couldn't see anything. They had expected some kind of medical room, or even a makeshift one for Luffy's treatment. Instead, they were in some kind of dark cave that had walls caked with ice. Luffy was lying on a table, and was being held down with so many chains that it would have been impossible for him to move at all. Luffy was now covered with purple splashes and frostbite, while he was wearing nothing but his torn and burnt shorts. Ivankov was still standing there, looking down at him as Luffy shook and writhed, though with all the chains there all he could do was twitch. Wait, where are we? What's going on? Nami cried out, stepping back. I thought that he was here to help, Luffy. Chopper yelled out furiously as Ivankov merely looked down at Luffy in curiosity. Oh, I'm sure he is, Robin frowned. But there must be a reason for. Reason? He looks like he's about to be tortured before he dies. Zoro snapped as Ivankov sighed. Allow me to explain how my powers work, Straw Hat Boy, he said seriously. We have the powers of the Horm fruit. What it means is that we have the ability to create and control hormones that can affect one's body. Hormones? Really? Usopp asked skeptically. That's got to be the stupidest power I've heard yet, Frankie muttered, wondering who came up with these devil fruits. But how could that power help them? Which means, we can inject VU with some special hormones that will be able to save VU, Ivankov whispered. It wasn't clear if Luffy could understand what he was saying, given his current state, but he was at least listening to his words. By injecting these hormones, it will release your body's immune system to its full potential, Ivankov went on. In other words, if you are willing to go through with it, your immune system will become strong enough to fight off the poison. So that's how Luffy got such a badass immune system that he can fight off normal poison like it's nothing. Frankie said in understanding, but he looked to the chains and his happiness faded slightly, for he still was lost as to what was going to happen here. Chopper, however, was thinking about Ivankov's words and looking at the chains as he slowly began to realize what this all meant. But be warned, Ivankov went on, since the hormones only unleash the immune system's potential, the chance of survival is mostly based off your own will to live. And as well as having to give up a certain amount of lifespan to compensate for the energy used to heal the damage. Wait, what's he saying? Brook asked in bafflement. I don't understand. He means that he's going to be cutting off time from Luffy's own lifespan in order to use his treatment, but that may not be enough to save him, Robin said, having understood most of it. But if Luffy's gonna live, then it all depends on how badly he wants to. Well, we shouldn't have to worry about that, right? Usopp asked at once, with a rather shaky smile. I mean, Luffy's will isn't normal, right? His will to live is always stronger than anything. But before anyone could answer him, Ivankov was speaking again. However, we feel that we should tell VU that the process will be far from pleasant. What do you mean? Was all Luffy could croak out. Yes, what do you mean by that? Brook asked, though he knew he wasn't going to like the answer. Pain, Ivankov said simply. The healing process will force VU to experience a pain that VU have never felt before. If we can make it easy for VU by giving VU something that will make VU last few hours warm and painless. But VU will die. That's the gamble and all that VU've got left going for you. I can't say I'm happy about either choice, Zoro said, wondering just what kind of pawn he had in mind. And no, Luffy hissed out, breathing harder than ever. I can't die yet, not until I see Ace. V will only ask this once more, Ivankov said at once. V am not playing around when we say that it will be painful. It is for this that we had to keep VU chained down here. Luffy glanced over at the chains with a look of surprise, as if he just realized that they were there. The chains are to keep VU from ripping out your own eyes and tear your body in half, Ivankov answered bluntly, and we have to keep VU down here so that we don't go deaf from the sounds of your agonized screams. At those words, they all felt a coldness sink in the pits of their stomachs, suddenly pale as the snow, their eyes white as pinwheels as they stared at the scene. Was that possible? Could Luffy have? Did he really? No, Chopper said at once, stepping forward, halfway to putting a stop to all this. No, he can't really do that, can he? Sanji knew that Ivankov loved to joke and fool people. But one thing he never fooled about was when someone's life was on the line. No, he was willing to bet his favorite cooking pot that he was telling Luffy nothing but the honest truth here. It will feel as if your body is being torn apart from the inside, Ivankov warned him. And VU will experience this pain for 2 entire days, no less. And VU can forget about ever blacking out. The pain will deny VU even that much. Your only chance is to withstand the pain until your body has been able to fight off the poison. Yet, there is still a chance that will not be enough to save VU from the hands of death. Hey, stop, Usopp yelled, his eyes wide. He knew that this was Luffy's only chance, but idea of seeing him in the kind of pain that this guy was talking about was too much for him to bear the thought of. Yeah, there's got to be another way. Nami yelled out. I don't think that there is, Sanji said, growing pale and wondered what the hell that bastard was gonna do to Luffy here. Luffy was still panting hard. I got it. Ivankov looked over him carefully before he looked up and declared, as for the price of the treatment. 10 years of V your life. V will be cutting off 10 V years of your lifespan, Straw Hat Boy. 10 years. Brook gasped out. In other words, Robin said, her eyes widening in understanding, Luffy must give up 10 years of his life in exchange for this treatment. How the hell is that fair? Usopp yelled as the realization what Luffy had done. Luffy you actually, Luffy what the hell did you do? He gave up 10 years of his life. Brook croaked as he fell to his knees, shocking hitting him over the head like a ton of bricks. No, Chopper cried out, shaking his head, refusing to believe it. No, he can't have. He didn't. I think he did, Sanji whispered, knowing about Ivan's powers and knew that this was the only way. Given how bad Luffy's condition was, there wasn't any other choice but to do what he said. Luffy seemed to understand this whole thing as well, for he managed to gasp out, okay. Okay, that's all he's gonna say. Nami cried out furiously. He's giving up 10 years of his life just like that in ACT like it's no big deal. What other choice does he have? Zoro asked harshly. It's either give up 10 years or your life completely. But he understood her feelings here. He was horrified and angry about this whole thing, furious that Luffy never told them about this. But more so for letting get this far to begin with. Damn, what the hell was the matter with them? How could they let it get this bad that Luffy would be forced to make such a deal? He gave up 10 years of his life while down in this hole. He was more than angry, he was infuriated that something like this could happen, and it was all that he could do to keep himself from screaming outright. However, Ivankov went on, even using those 10 years, I cannot guarantee your survival. It'll only increase your chances from 0 to 2 or 3%. Whether you live or die, it depends on your own will to live. Risk a painful death with those kind of odds. How is that fair? Frankie yelled out as Chopper covered his eyes, shame filling his entire body at how it had come to all of this. Though none of them were able to tear their eyes away from Luffy for long. If you die, then the poison wins, Ivankov stated, but if you escape with you live, then you win. Hell of a game, Sanji yelled as Ivankov held up his fingers, and they became sharp and syringe-like. Have a nice journey to the brink of death, he informed him. Emporio healing hormone. Ivankov then stabbed his syringe-like fingers into Luffy's sides, making him scream out. Ivankov pulled his hands away and for a few moments nothing else seemed to happen. But then, Luffy gasped as if something was seriously wrong as he began to cough up more blood. He was grinding his teeth together before he let out a loud, blood-curdling scream of agony as he struggled against his bonds. His body arched upwards, looking like he could have broken his spine in half if he wasn't made of rubber. But this scream wasn't like any other that they had ever heard of before, and just the mere sound of it felt like their world was shattering around them. Luffy! Brook and the weakling trio cried out as Luffy began to thrash worse than ever and began to scream out so loudly that it was as if he was being burned alive. But screaming and crying were all that they could do as they watched Ivankov leave the room and left Luffy there alone. Normally they would be angry at that, but the only thing they felt was horror as Luffy's breathing became more and more laborious as pain shook his body. Scream, after blood-curdling scream broke through the frigid air as the blood came. Blood began to squirt out of his body at every point like he was sprouting leaks. Only instead of water, blood began to dribble out of him and soon he was covered in it and it began to drip to the floor like a red sheet. There was so much blood that it was actually starting to turn black like ink from the poison that was mixing with it as he continued to scream and arch painfully where he lay strapped to the damn table. Luffy gritted his teeth as he tried to fight the pain, but he might not have done anything for all the good that it did, for he couldn't hold it back. His eyes rolled back as tears of blood began to fall and a fountain of more blood came bursting from his mouth. The Straw Hats were all left in a terrible state, they couldn't bear to look but were unable to turn away. I can't stand listening to this. Usopp cried, trying to cover his ears as he fell to his knees again. How could they be so cruel? Brook yelled, losing his mind watching. How is this treatment? Luffy screamed and the Straw Hats felt their hearts breaking. He's pushing Luffy's immune system beyond its limits. Chopper cried, tears falling as he turned his head away from the galleons of blood that were falling. He's rebuilding his body so that it can withstand the poison. His insides are being broken down and rapidly rebuilt back up, over and over. There had to have been another way. Nami yelled as she also began to start sobbing. What choice? Zoro stated through gritted teeth. You heard them. Luffy was poisoned to past being curable. He's gonna die. Usopp screamed out, tears flooding down. His body's all battered. It's gonna break him, and tear him, he's already dead. It's terrible. Help him, please. Take off those chains and stop the bleeding. Something, do something. Anything. Sanji couldn't answer as he held his hand up to hide his eyes. Even if death was all that he had waiting, nothing would have changed. Luffy knew that this was his only way out and was, at least, brave enough to face it all. But just then, the screaming stopped for a moment. Luffy, Nami whispered. Luffy was gasping for breathing, grinding his teeth so hard that they were surprised that he didn't grind them to dust, and then they heard him say just one name. Ace. They stared at him. Even though he was suffering like this, even if he was fighting for his life, the only thing that he was thinking of right now was his big brother. Even as his body is literally being torn apart. Luffy, Chopper croaked before he looked up and began to shout, "You can do it, Luffy. Don't give up, yet. You have to keep living. We know you pull through. So do it already." Sanji yelled, hating the fact that Luffy was putting them through all this. The memory blacked out, which took them all aback, though they weren't completely upset about that either. At least until they saw that they were back with Ace and Jinbei in their dark cell. Ace was looking worse than ever before. He looked like he was close to losing his mind being stuck down here, and Jinbei was looking over at him anxiously, as if fearing that something bad was happening inside Ace's own mind. "I hope that Ace never heard about this," Nami whispered, trying to wipe her tears from before away, but it was just too much to bear at the thought of these two brothers going through all this. "Ace," Zoro said, shaking his head, his longing to break something was so great that he had to stop himself from going over and attacking the cook. But he wasn't sure how much longer he can hold that desire to break something to vent his frustration. "Ace," Jinbei said suddenly, as if trying to put his mind at ease. "I don't know what that woman said is true, but wouldn't it be better to assume she was lying? But what would be the point of coming all the way down here if she was going to lie?" Robin asked sadly. How else could she know about Luffy? And not only that, but Ace knows better than anyone what Luffy's like, Sanji said, trying to get rid of the image of Luffy slowly bleeding to death before their eyes. He knows that is something that he would do. But his words did far from calming Ace down. On the contrary, Ace struggled against the chains as he yelled out, "You think she came all the way down here just to lie to me?" The guards that were standing there looked back at him, ready to use their weapons if he got violent. But after a moment, he seemed to realize that he was venting his anger against the wrong person and calmed down slightly. But his face was still twisted with worry. "Sorry, Jinbei," he said, screwing up his eyes. "But that's just the kind of brother he is. He's always doing stupid things like that. Ever since we were kids he's been making me worry about him. That idiot. Oh, I just feel so terrible here." Brook cried out as Ace's face was held with a mixture of all sorts of emotions there. Sadness, guilt, but most of all, rage. And suddenly he began to let out a loud scream of fury as he struggled against the shackles holding him there. "Let me out." Ace began banging his head on the wall, blood starting to drip down from where he was hitting himself. "Let me out of here. Let me go. Ace, stop it. You're in no shape." Chopper cried out, staring at those wounds. "Why are these two so stubborn?" Nami cried as Jinbei was yelling at Ace to stop as well. But Ace was going so nuts there that the guards called in the Minotaurus to come and deal with it. They watched as the cow thing from before, his head covered in bandages, came over and limped into the cell. Ace only glared up at him angrily as he was struck against with the club and more blood went flying. "I can't watch this," Nami cried, covering her face and hiding it in Robin's shirt, who nearly held her tightly. "I can't watch them suffering like this. You can tell that they're brothers," Zoro said as Ace hung limply in those chains, blood dripping down his neck and face. "They really did care about each other, and were willing to do anything, give up everything, for the other." Ace knew that it was useless to struggle with those damn sea prism stone cuffs on him, having them rob his strength and power, but his desire to get out and find Luffy had been so strong that was enough to get them to deal with him with brute strength. "Make it easy for yourself and just stay quiet." One of the guards boosted arrogantly, "Your death is in another 10 hours. 10 hours. Usopp cried out, "Oh God, and Luffy, he's been suffering like that for, I would say at least a few hours already." Robin groaned out in despair as Ace hung there, but glared up at the guards. And they knew that those chains weren't there, those guards wouldn't be acting so cocky. But he held his ground as the Minotaurus raised his club again. "Luffy," he whispered as the club came swinging down again and the memory blacked out. The Straw Hats all felt like they were the ones who were losing their minds. Usopp had even fallen to his knees and banged his head against the floor to try and free himself from some of the pain that was going on inside him. But the memory of the dark room with Luffy chained there had soon appeared and he was kneeling in Luffy's blood, shocking him so much that he went scooting away as fast as he could though it wasn't really there. To think that Luffy looked better when he was poisoned, here, he was barely alive. He continued to scream in pain as his skin looked like it was bubbling and his muscles were spasming out as his body was now melting on the inside. Luffy remained awake, the entire time that seemed to stretch onwards to an infinite void of pain and suffering. "They're killing him," Brook cried out, trying to grab Luffy's hand and hold it tightly as another wave of blood splashed onto the floor. "Couldn't they have knocked him out or something?" Zoro asked loudly, having to fight the urge to cover his ears, though he was sure that Luffy was going to blow his eardrums. "How are you supposed to sleep through that?" Sanji yelled back as Usopp had to turn away and began to dry heave from the sight of it all. Nami was sobbing into Robin's blouse as Robin's own eyes were shadowed over, showing just how distressed she really was about all this. Chopper cried outright, sobbing loudly at how he couldn't at least be there to help Luffy through it. He wanted to be there. Even if there wasn't anything he could do but stay by his side and tell him that it was going to be alright. He had sat by every single one of his crewmates when they were sick, and the time that Luffy needed him there the most, he wasn't able to help. Brook didn't say anything as he watched, but tears flooded down his face. Even dying was less painful than this. If there was some way that he could have taken all the suffering away, he would. In fact, he was wishing that it was him that was there, taking in all that pain. If he could have done that much for Luffy, he'd do it happily and without regret. He glanced at Zoro, he would know that better than anyone, that would he. But the thing was, he couldn't help Luffy this time, and that must be eating him up more than anyone. Usopp was still on his knees as tears dripped from his eyes and down his long nose. How could he have not been there to support Luffy? What kind of friend was he when his captain was in such pain? And then there was what happened with Ace. How could Luffy handle all this on his own? Zoro merely watched, unable to look away even as most of the others could no longer bear the sight of their friend like this. None of them knew how long they were down there, but the minutes soon turned into hours. It was impossible to know for sure since they gave up checking for time. Maybe it was wishful thinking, or due to the blood loss, but they could have sworn that they heard a faint voice echoing off from far away. Yelling out support. You can do it. You can live. You have to live. Luffy, you can do it. Luffy. Don't give up, yet. You have to keep living. But not once did Luffy's screams let up. After what felt like years of watching this scene, Luffy's screams slowly began to quiet and the bleeding was stopping. But seeing how he looked afterwards was almost as bad as the hours of watching him screaming was almost as bad. Luffy was bone thin, looking much like how he looked when Crocodile dried up all the water in him, only this time there was no fat or muscle left. In fact, he was so thin, he was able to slip out from under the heavy chains and he collapsed in the pool of his own blood. Standing up was seemingly too painful for him as his shrieks finally stopped and he lay there, his eyes wide and staring ahead, unseeingly. My God, Luffy, Nami whispered as she finally raised her head and stared in shock at what he had become. This is treatment. Chopper then went nuts, trying to yell at Luffy to lay back down as they watched him slowly push himself up to his feet, breathing hard and stumbling as he fell to all fours once again. Naturally, Luffy didn't listen as his stomach let out a loud moan and he crawled to the door before he pounded on it. Wham! He hit the door so hard that it looked like it might break in half, and they heard the sounds of what had to be chains rattling it. The door kept shaking as Luffy kept hitting it, but it wouldn't open no matter how hard the door was hit. But they could hear him panting heavily along with the rumble of a stomach. I think that someone might be hungry, Sanji said when suddenly. Food. He yelled so loud it was like a whirlwind and suddenly they heard cheering going on from the outside and even they were smiling at the fact that Luffy was alive. Food. Luffy screamed out again and several minutes later, they saw the doors open and the room was full of people dressed like drag queens, each one had large plates of food. It was almost funny to watch as they heard whistles being blown and these guys running back and forth, bringing all sorts of food. Bring the food, quickly. It doesn't matter if it's raw. Just bring in as much as possible. Poor bastards, Sanji sighed as the food was thrown in and they could hear Luffy eating whatever he could grab before he tossed the empty plates out the door. This continued for some time, at least a half hour, and he continued to get bigger and bigger. Amazing, one of them cried, watching Luffy swallowing a huge leg of meat as plates and dishes clattered. He's sucking it all in like an antlion pit. Like a black hole, Nami said as they walked out of the cave and stood with the others as they watched the food disappearing into the darkness, never to be seen again. How long is he gonna keep eating? Someone asked. He's been going at this for 30 whole minutes. Another yelled and they were amazed, but not the least bit sorry as they watched Luffy's stretching arms grabbing as much food as he could. They wanted him to eat all that he wanted to, he more than earned it. He's eaten several days worth of Newcama Land's food supply. Said one of the Newcamas, staring in horror. That's nothing, Frankie laughed, not knowing or caring what this, Newcama Land, was. It was only because of Sanji that he hasn't eaten us out of house and home. That's quite impressive vitality, Ivankov muttered, watching in great amazement. That's for sure, Brook whispered, thinking of all those long hours of torture. At last they heard the clanging of the last dish fall and he came out. At least they thought it was him. A strange figure did, indeed, lumber out of the door, but, the top part was bone thin, but everything below his chest was giant, while his legs returned to being thin. What did he do to himself? Frankie yelled in shock as some of the others shrieked. What is that creature? That thing's not human. Luffy was still panting, grunting in pain as he absorbed all that fat in his stomach. And as if his dying limbs sucked it up, he shrank and the fat turned into muscle, spreading out to his limbs and the rest of his body. So when he fully stepped out, he was looking strong and healthy once again. Taking a deep breath he punched the air and screamed. I'm, ba-a-c-c-c-c-c-c-k-k-k-k-k.